Hello and welcome to the opening night of Screening Rights Film Festival in 2020. Thank you for joining us. I wish we were in a venue being able to see each other and be in the same room, but we are also benefiting from the fact that we're online and being able to bring together a panel from all over the world, actually. So that's wonderful. I'm not going to say much. For those of you who weren't in the introduction earlier, this is our 6th edition and we're online, and this is the opening night, and there are many more wonderful films and events to come over the next 4 days. We're delighted to have Evans Chan's We Have Boots to kick off with, and we've got a fantastic panel for you all. I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Shirley Ye, who's a lecturer at the University of Birmingham, specializing in Chinese and global history, and she'll be chairing the event this evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michelle, for this really kind invitation. I'm super happy to be here to introduce this incredibly important film and, really incredibly amazing and admirable co-panelists. So first, I'd like to introduce Professor Michael Davis, he's currently a visiting professor in the law faculty at the University of Hong Kong, where he teaches classes on human rights. And he's also a global fellow at the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., and a senior research scholar in the Weatherhead East Asia Institute at Columbia University. And he's just published a really, incredibly relevant book on Hong Kong entitled Making Hong Kong China, the Rollback of Human Rights and the Rule of Law, which has just been released from Columbia University Press. And, after watching the documentary last night, I'm just super, I feel very, very privileged to be sharing this panel with Ray Wong, who is a Hong Kong activist. In 2015, Ray Wong founded Hong Kong Indigenous, which you'll have just seen, whose slogan, "Liberate Hong Kong, the revolution of our time," has become one of the main slogans in the anti-extradition law movement in this last year. And he was charged with inciting a riot due to the fishball revolution in 2016. And in May 2018, he's been granted asylum by the German federal government, where he's now studying political science and philosophy at the University of Göttingen. And finally, of course, I'm super pleased to introduce the film director, Evans Chan. He's New York and Hong Kong based filmmaker who's been chronicling the situation in Hong Kong over the last 2 to 3 decades in both narrative and documentary films. And this film that we've just seen tonight has won the Edward Snowden Award for the Berlin Size of the Night Festival. Evans is also is an incredibly intellectual and academic and also very musical artist. And he has a PhD in screen cultures and film studies from Northwestern University, but you also have a philosophy. Evans also has a philosophy background, so it's just incredibly important to see. So thank you so much. I think so to start, I think we're gonna I just want to ask first let's if we could turn to Professor Michael Davis. If you I was wondering if you could provide some background on kind of the legal situation, the global legal context that the film takes place against.
Okay, thank you, Shirley. I really appreciate a chance to again be on board with Evans and one of his films. The last time we were sitting in front of the audience in the theater when this was introduced in New York. And so I'm glad to see that it's still flourishing and now in the UK. Evans and I have had now, I think, several years of kind of a conversation going on about what we do, and especially relating to Hong Kong. So I think for me, in a very quick sort of version to just help people understand what's going on, I'll just highlight the kinds of commitments made to Hong Kong and the status of them, what's happened to them. And then there's lots of responses to that in the political community. Ray Wong, in fact, his group representing one of those responses. But, you know, the thing about it is Hong Kong, I like for people to imagine that Hong Kong's kind of like London or New York. It's one of these big financial centers in the world. It's a place where lots of people come and go. So people who come from Hong Kong love Hong Kong, but people from all around the world do. They're paying attention to what's happening there. As it said locally in Hong Kong, it's a global city. And so because of this, when Hong Kong was going to be returned to China by Britain, they made all sorts of promises in a treaty, and they promised a high degree of autonomy, that the common law system from the British would be maintained, human rights and basic freedoms, International Human Rights Treaty would apply, and so on. And so all of these kinds of promises were made. And then over one of the things they did is they promised that a basic law would be drafted, and they stipulated the content of the basic law would be from this treaty, this Sino-British treaty returning Hong Kong. And the thing I often point out is there's a couple, generally the basic law looked like the treaty, but there's a couple areas that I think have caused almost all the problems ever since. One is that, you know, the common law was to be maintained, but then in the basic law, they provided that the National People's Congress Standing Committee would have the ultimate power to interpret the basic law, which has meant that a political body has the ultimate power to decide what, you know, a high degree of autonomy means, what maintaining human rights and the rule of law means. So this has been one problem. Another problem, it was recognized at the beginning that for Hong Kong people to rule Hong Kong, they needed democracy. And so there was a promise of universal suffrage. But in that promise, they kind of talked about gradual and orderly progress. And what we've seen ever since is Beijing dragging its heels on allowing the democratic reform. So these two things, and Beijing actually in 2004 overrode part of the basic law, which said that Hong Kong could establish democracy in its legislature on its own, and in effect gave Beijing the approval even over the legislative elections. And so the result is these two things have created in Hong Kong a government that seems to serve Beijing more than it serves Hong Kong. And I think this is at the heart of the problem, because the officials in that government are, you know, through a complicated process of an election committee that Beijing controls, essentially chosen and appointed by Beijing. And so they answer to their boss. And so instead of representing, even finding a voice for Hong Kong, they tend to find only Beijing's voice to explain to Hong Kong rather than the other way around. And I think this has been at the heart of the problem. And so we saw protest. I was one of the Article 23 concern group way back in 2003, when at that time we were trying to stop national security laws. So this is not new. We were trying to get in the way of that. 9 of us wrote a bunch of pamphlets. I wrote one of them. We held press conferences. And to our surprise, Hong Kong people stood for their rights. 500,000 of them came to the streets, and eventually that proposal, that law that the Hong Kong government proposed, was withdrawn. And so that's just one of them. Then Hong Kong, through Beijing's encouragement, tried to impose patriotic education on Hong Kong. And I think that gave rise to almost all the youth movement we see there now. And then they came to life again in the umbrella movement of 2014 and 15, when the Hong Kong people were demanding that this democracy that was promised be delivered. And then in 2019, there's a kind of frustration in politics, and people feeling, well, we've tried peaceful demonstrations, we're very Gandhian, nonviolent movements and so on, but no one listens. 2 million people marched on the streets of Hong Kong in 2019. Nothing happened. Only after there was a kind of vandalism of the Legislative Council that finally Beijing withdrew, actually suspended, but eventually withdrew this bill. So the result is there's this government that's not listening, either in Hong Kong or Beijing. And so Beijing sees all these protests. Almost all of them are nonviolent. Only a little bit of violence emerges when the police start getting very heavy-handed in their approach. And we all saw that on our TV sets in 2019. So this was all visible. And so then along comes 2020, instead of saying during this pause, the pandemic kind of caused a pause in these protests, at least the size of them. During this pause, instead of taking advantage of it, Beijing decides to impose a national security law on Hong Kong. And in effect saying, you know, we don't want to hear from you. And what we see in the way they're carrying this law out is they're trying to silence the opposition in Hong Kong. So it's interesting, they target even some of the elders of the democracy movement who were basically promoting nonviolence and trying to encourage the younger activists in that vein. So why would you target them? Obviously, it seems to me Beijing has a list of people that it wants to take down. And so this is sort of where it's at. The national security law, I think when it comes, you know, I always had this theory that Hong Kong people, when they ask for democracy, they're always asking for two things. They're asking for democracy, a say in their government, but they're also asking to maintain the rule of law. When you do opinion polls in Hong Kong, the rule of law is always at the top of Hong Kong's core values. And so what they want to see is that the government is subject to the laws, and the national security law turns that on its head. It sets up a committee and an office on national security, and both of them expressly are not subject to constitutional judicial review. They're not subject to judicial review. This Office of Mainland China in Hong Kong under the national security law is not even subject to the jurisdiction of Hong Kong. And it even has the power to do secret, all their investigations are secret, to do secret investigations. We have a secret police now under this law, and they have the power to remove someone to the mainland to put them on trial. And it doesn't stop in Hong Kong because the law applies worldwide. I mean, even what we're saying here now could be targeted by this law. It's interesting. I was on a panel for the Law Society via Zoom, and there was Maria Tam and Elsie Lung, two very prominent pro-Beijing figures. And I said, are you sure you're not colluding with foreigner? Because I'm speaking here, and if I say things that may cause, the law says if someone speaks and causes contempt or hatred of the government, then they're engaged in subversion. And then collusion would be working with outside forces to bring sort of sanctions or something against Hong Kong, or if the outside forces are causing contempt or hatred. So really what it does, the law very clearly is trying to silence opposition. And the other thing it's trying to do is tame the courts. So the very core value of Hong Kong, the rule of law, is under threat because, one, they even designate a panel of judges who can even hear these cases. Not all judges can do it because not all judges are trusted. And then some judges that dismiss charges or don't do what the public prosecutors want them to do are actually attacked in the media. There's huge attacks on them in the Dagong Bao, the pro-Beijing newspapers and so on. So this is the sort of situation we have. Now, it makes people in Hong Kong feel the situation's almost hopeless, but people don't want to be hopeless. And one would hope that somebody in the government would understand. I wrote a book because I really want people to read and understand what's happening. Maybe somebody will wake up. One of the most disappointing things is no one in the pro-Beijing camp or the establishment camp, as we call it in Hong Kong, has said no to any of this. Just said, no, I'm not going to do it. They just don't. And this has been a problem from day one. If the pro-Beijing and pro-establishment camp in Hong Kong over these years had used the opportunity of access to Beijing simply to explain Hong Kong people's concerns, I don't think we would be where we are today. So I don't blame protesters for being over-energetic in their protest. I blame these officials for not speaking up for Hong Kong, for not finding a voice. So I'll stop there. I welcome questions, but I hope this gives you a sense of the passion that lies behind these problems in Hong Kong. Very much a part of that film, which I very much enjoyed. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Michael. We're going to come back to you've said so many things that I think we're going to pick up on again in this conversation. But for now, I'd like to, Ray, I was really kind of struck by your conviction and your passion in the documentary. And I just, I know that you've been away from Hong Kong for a couple years now,
Right.
almost a couple years. I mean, I was wondering, can you reflect a bit on yourself in the film that we just saw?
Well, I think in the course of my activism in Hong Kong, I was constantly changing. In the very beginning, as an ordinary participant in the umbrella revolutions, I was a supporter. I was a big fan of non-violence tactics. I remember on one day during the occupation movement, I was holding an A4 paper asking some radical protester to calm down. But then at that moment, why I was so much into the non-violence tactics, because I I thought the Hong Kong government and the Chinese government still have a kind of sympathy to Hong Kong people. So as long as we stick to the non-violence tactic and use our protests and movements to pressurize the government, we hope the Hong Kong government would eventually listen to us. But after a couple of weeks in the umbrella revolutions, what we have learned from the Hong Kong government and the police is that as long as we are not strong enough to really bring them damage or really create enough pressure on the Hong Kong government, they won't listen to us. So at that point on, I started thinking, okay, so what kind of tactics is effective for us to pressurize the Hong Kong government? At that time, already some protesters support the tactic of be walked, because it was very logical. If we stay in the same place in that street, occupation sites, the government could easily monitor and to know what protester would do next, and everything is predictable for them, and they can already think maybe 2-3 steps further. And so we not having advantage to in this battle. So some protesters already support the be walked tactic. They think the best way to pressurize the government is to run around in different places to create a kind of chaos to unstabilize the society, so that the Hong Kong government would eventually really listen to people. So after the umbrella revolutions, I got to know a group of like-minded young people during the protests, and we were actually thinking what we could do. We first tried to join other events organized by other organizations or parties, but we realized that the existing parties and organizations don't really represent our idea. So as there are no one representing our idea and our adopting our tactics, the best way for us is to fund our own party. So I founded Hong Kong Indigenous. Our main objectives was to preserve the freedom of Hong Kong and fight for democracy by emphasizing our unique Hong Konger identity. Because since very long after the hangover, the Chinese government as well as the Hong Kong government keep saying that Hong Kong people, Chinese people, we having black hairs, yellow skin, black eyes. So we are from the same family. We should, even though we share different values, but Hong Kong people should tolerate them. But to us young generations, it sounds pretty ridiculous. Yes, like my parents, they are also immigrants from China. They were born in China, not in Hong Kong. But after coming to Hong Kong, they have already adopted the values of the Hong Kong society. They believe in rule of law, like Michael said, and democracy and freedom. But Chinese people, they so far we know, we got in touch, and the Chinese government, they don't really believe in such values. Not only that, the Chinese government and the Hong Kong government attempt to devalue our values and to degrade our unique culture. So for us, young generation, we think first we have to distinguish from Chinese people. We are not Chinese, we are Hong Konger, so we can think out the box. Because the pandemic, the traditional pro-democracy politicians, they also identify themselves as Chinese. So when it comes to the sovereignty of Hong Kong, they would always say, oh, we are from the same family, Hong Kong, Chinese, we should not separate from China. Actually, back to 2014, 2015, no one in Hong Kong really supported Hong Kong independence. But as we have seen in the past year, democracy, our freedom have been being eroded by, encouraged by the Hong Kong government. One country, two systems cannot preserve our unique way of living. What can we do? The only way out is to get away from China. So after founding Hong Kong indigenous, we first emphasize our identity and more proactive means of protesting, and then we gradually shift to advocating Hong Kong independence. And also because of that, my party got banned from running elections, and because of the fishbowl revolution, I was charged with participating, rioting, inciting a riot, and also inciting an illegal assembly. The sentence of these three charges could be up to 10 years. That's why I fled to Germany. And after coming to Germany, I also reflect on my old tactics and also my new role in Germany. In Hong Kong, I was an political leader. I was a leader of a political party. So I believe that my role is to provide a vision for the movement in Hong Kong and also for the future of Hong Kong. But as now I could no longer go back to Hong Kong, and also as being in Germany, I could not really get information on the ground. So I think it's not appropriate for me to suggest anything because of the discrepancy between my information and the reality in Hong Kong. So I last year I disclosed my refugee status, and I also announced that I no longer advocate Hong Kong independence. What I am focusing is to raise awareness internationally so that more Western countries and Western people will be aware of what is happening in Hong Kong. And yeah, so I think this is the change of my role.
Thank you so much, Ray. I mean, just to follow up, do you think you'll ever return to Hong Kong?
I wish I could go back to Hong Kong. I think the only possibility that I can go back to Hong Kong is CCP collapse, like Soviet Union.
Wow. I want to kind of ask a follow-up question to something that Michael mentioned, and I think probably affected you deeply, Ray, which is, you know, what are your views on the language and education imposition from Beijing? I mean, because one of the striking things in Evans's film is, of course, language, right? The kind of smooth back and forth between English and Cantonese, right? And yet there is a language imposition from Beijing to speak Putonghua. You know, maybe some of the audience members, you know, who are not Chinese speakers will not have picked up that the language that's spoken by the activists, it is Chinese, but it's Cantonese, right? And that's very significant of identity. So I was wondering, can you kind of speak about that moment, or speak about language? I mean, you know, you mentioned your parents came from China. They must have, you know, brought, you know, I don't know what part of China they came from, but maybe
they came from Canton, but they speak Hot Loa. Okay. Yeah, it's a dialect in Canton region. Yeah. Back to 2012, at that time, Michael also mentioned the Hong Kong government proposed change of the national education curriculum, in which Hong Kong students should learn how to be patriotic to the history of and the ideology of the Chinese Communist Party. And also more striking is that in the curriculum, students would learn that why the society in the US is so unstable is because they have democracy. So it's better to adopt a system like in China, only one party ruling the whole country. This is contradicted to what we Hong Kong people believe. Hong Kong people believe in rule of law, in democracy, and also all kinds of freedoms. But in that curriculum, we can see what make Hong Kong people are degraded, are devalued. And actually, this is only an aspect in which the Chinese government and Hong Kong government attempts to cleanse our own identity, and also like publications in Hong Kong, the biggest publications company is controlled by the China Liaison Office, and this publication owns the 3 biggest book retails in Hong Kong. So we can see that the Chinese government and Hong Kong government attempts to cleanse our own identity in many different ways, not only in education.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ray. I just want to turn to Evans now. Evans, I mean, you know, I mean, some of your earliest films, right? Like one of your earliest films was made right around the time of the student protest movement in 1989 in Tiananmen. And I just wanted to get your thoughts on, you know, how do you, and you've been chronicling the situation in Hong Kong for a couple of decades now. And I was wondering if you could reflect on how are the Hong Kong protests since 2014 different from, you know, what we saw in Tiananmen in 1989, just before the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union. I think you have to unmute.
Yes, hi. Yeah, Yeah, I mean, you are talking about some different kind of comparison. What are students like in Beijing in terms of 89? And what are students' demand like, or young people's demand like in Hong Kong today? Now, of course, you have a very different situation and different dynamic and level of sophistication about what civil society means. In Beijing of 89, I was there, I happened to be in Beijing in late May. You know, the students were asking something very basic, dialogue with officials. Basically, they were a lot more timid in terms of asking. I mean, now in Hong Kong, of course, with Occupy and all that, it's very clear goal. I mean, you have universal suffrage, and for example, you know, one of the, they have the so-called 5 demands in 2019, and for example, asking the government not to declare that as a riot, or, you know, and, you know, so there are all these civic and civic education background behind that. Actually, when Benny Tai and first introduced the idea of civil disobedience to Hong Kong, he had the American model. I mean, Martin Luther King Jr. So there was a lot of pedagogical intent behind that. So I mean, they kind of run all this deliberation day, and they want to create this public space. I mean, I think there's something Habermas there as well, in terms of, you know, getting people to talk and discuss and engage in politics. So there is a very clear civic education background to the demand. So I mean, you are talking about a very different level of political demand put forward by the students. So that is the main difference. But you have to know that in terms of the Soviet collapse at that time, it was how Tiananmen impact Europe. It was the East German government deciding not to adopt the Chinese model, that, you know, allowing people to go to the West, or, you know, first go through Czechoslovakia, or I think Czechoslovakia, to go to the West, etc. And that led to the demise of the Soviet Union. And actually, ever since, one of the main things that I understand China developed was to be aware of the danger of something like that happening to China. So I think we've seen it strengthening its security tactics, etc. You know, up to now, you know, what we saw in Hong Kong today is, you know, they were earlier on, they thought the umbrella movement was a color revolution, as they say. And now they also think that it's all caused by Western influence. That's why collusion with the West is so important and all that. Now, there is an international circulation of ideas. I mean, otherwise, why would Benny Tai pick up the letter from Birmingham jail as a seminal text for him to develop those civil disobedience tactics, etc. And I think Ray and also Professor Davis have pointed out that there seems to be a general frustration with the civil disobedience and non-violent tactics, peaceful protests. And that's why some young folks like Ray, you know, feel that there has to be more militancy in confronting the government. And also they were angry at the police, you know, use of force. So, I mean, it got into a vicious circle to some extent. And each time the protester feel that they have pushed back a little bit, then it's a stronger policy being imposed on them. I think we've seen small gains. I mean, like when Ray, you know, engaged those smugglers or day traders. I mean, day trippers. I mean, they are not in stock market. I mean, there's those day trippers, shopping in Hong Kong, and they are considered smugglers, etc. They are called parallel traders, I guess. Yeah. Then China relaxed a little bit. I mean, hold back, and then not allowing them to come to Hong Kong so often, once a week, that they are allowed to come. So you feel that China seems to back down at times, and also like the extradition bill. At first, that violent reaction from the people caused them to shelve the bill and not withdrawing it. And the next thing is now we have national security. So it's getting tighter and tighter, and that's where we are today.
Thank you so much, Evans. And I have a question about the style of this film. While I was watching the film, I heard and I saw elements of your previous films evident in We Are Boots, such as the music, for example. And I was just wondering if you could just kind of speak about the artistic style of this film and how it's in dialogue with some of your previous works.
It's always, yeah, I mean, I don't feel that this should be a forum talking about filmmaking too much. But anyway, with film, you're always dealing with three levels. You're dealing with sound. Sound include dialogues and music and even silence. And then, so you have the text, you have the language in there, and then you have the visuals in there, and you have the sound world there. And for me, it's always the structuring principle is actually always music. I always have to know what sort of music I'll be using, because that create the ambience for you to approach the material. And also at times when you edit, you really need the music as a background. And different filmmakers have different approach. At times, they just make the film edit as is, and then ask the composer to just compose the music. You fit here, you have 1 minute, or you have 50 seconds there, feel it, I mean, some filmmaker do it that way. No, I always need to know the music first, and then the Marian Anderson song was important because it's predated Martin Luther King's civil rights movement. And it was a recasting of, a Jewish legend for Black struggles in the US. And to some extent, that's what Benny Tai brought to Hong Kong. And he has actually used the expression, or the story of Moses, parting the sea, to describe at one time how that movement occurred to him. So I just feel that there was a very pregnant piece of music for me to use, and then I worked with different composers. And so for me, is documentary, documentary, I do feel that it should be more than just about information. It should be an experience, film experience. And so that's when you talk about the artistry, I always have to, think about, what aspect to breathe, some sort of the integrity of that combination of sound, images, and text. And text is, of course, how to stream an interview. You talk to a person for so long, more than an hour, and you end up taking only 5 minutes or something. So I mean, so that's always requires some construction. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Evans. And I have a question for all of you, which is about identity, and it's also about Evans's previous films. In some of your prior films, Evans, you've always had very strong female characters or figures that play a role, right, in the movement of history, or in the inspiration of historical figures. In your film on Da Tong, on Kang Youwei and Lian Qichao, it's the daughter of Kang Yo-wei, who is the kind of the heroine of the movie. It's told from her perspective, right? And I mean, something that you can't but be struck by when watching this documentary, We Are Boots, is kind of course, like both the identity of the activists, right, in terms of both gender and generation, right, between Ray Wong's generation and Benny Tai's generation. And of course, there's also yeah, I mean, and there's it's Agnes Cho.
Yes.
Yeah, she's just such a strong, articulate, and very powerful voice in your figure. And you interview for her for quite some time. So I was just wondering if you could, speak about that, speak about the identity of the movement in terms of Hong Kong identity, gender identity, generational identity.
Well, I mean, I think historically there has always been a rivalry between North and South. And I think maybe Ray can address that even more later. But then, the identity thing, the Chinese identity was stronger in the sense that, Hong Kong people did not think themselves or need to consider themselves as being non-Chinese. And I also feel that has a lot to do with the cultural power that you were wielding. For the longest time, as I mentioned, for example, in '89, at that time, Hong Kong was in a much stronger position culturally. Hong Kong was one of the major movie making center. People in China were pirating Hong Kong films. They formed film clubs to watch Hong Kong films. And then you have the four male icons. They call it 四大天王, I mean, and they were very popular in China. And in '89, they have a saying about the two Dangs. The big Dan is Deng Xiaoping, who wields so much power. And they say that, but his influence doesn't compare with the small Deng, which is Teresa Tang in Hong Kong, because, she's actually from Taiwan originally, but she's based in Hong Kong. And so she's considered as this, powerful, popular culture. So at one time, Hong Kong has all this influence on China. And nobody will come to tell you, your language is not important. And you have to learn Putonghua and this and that. But that has shifted and that has changed. And that kind of cultural effort, would I say homogenization? I do feel that, it's never, it should not be a problem to learn another language. I mean, I think it's the approach. People feel that they are forced to learn it that is becoming sort of a problem. I understand that, some of the kids at school, they are not really allowed to speak Putonghua. And I also feel that we are entering internet culture. I think the internet culture has a tendency of intensify identity. In the old days, I think, in most of our correspondence, we write standard Chinese. And now with texting and all that, I have never seen as much spoken Cantonese being, used in texting. And that was there. So there is, I think there's that technological aspect. It's too easy to carry. I mean, I think that's the case everywhere in the world. And that's why assimilation becomes so difficult. I mean, you can just, with your iPhone, you carry your own culture from whatever country. You don't have to deal with the local culture very much. And I mean, we see more and more that kind of identity and ethnic conflicts in any way in the world or anyway. But with Hong Kong, I think that you are looking at, that kind of cultural pressure. And I also feel that there's a strong economic component to how this whole thing happened. I have spoken other platform. That one really moment revelation for me was in 2015. I was making Raise the Umbrella, so 2015, the Legislative Council. And I have all these interns, young university students helping me to film, various parts of Hong Kong, and I also used the earlier footage about the umbrella movement, to put the film together. So they came to my apartment. Now, I bought the apartment in the year 2006, 2007. My father died, I can trade in the public housing for, these, what they call government home ownership scheme apartment. At the time, I pay 100,000 US. And by 2015, this case came to my apartment. I start thinking, because we start asking, where do you live? And, blah, blah, blah. And then I realized my apartment at that time is more than half a million already. So you're talking about 5 or 6 fold of increase. I bought the apartment right before the real estate market skyrocketed. And now there's a whole background to that. It was because of SARS. When, mainland Chinese start coming to Hong Kong, they began buying up apartments. Now there is some belief that it could be money laundering. But of course, officially, China, the red capital is also moving into Hong Kong. So you have both the official and unofficial channel of hot money coming to Hong Kong real estate market. And I realized, so it was in, from 2007 to 2015, it was 6-7 years. And you are talking about if they're a kid in primary school, now they're in high school. If they're in high school, now they're in college. And that's the whole generation was getting so angry, getting stuck with their parents, feeling that they are trapped. And I do feel that there is a strong component to the Hong Kong demand because of that certain hopelessness among the younger people, the lack of social mobility. And in Raise the Umbrella, Arif Durley was still alive, and he said, and I think he has the finger on the situation. Democracy is a way to regain control of society and life. And they are feeling that, the Hong Kong government was not doing enough for them. And that's why they are out on the street and making demands. And the housing situation is just horrible. I recently heard, I heard the worst story I heard recently was this family. They start with 6 people, the grandparents, the parents, and then the 2 kids, and then the 2 sons. Then the 2 sons, they live in maybe 300 square feet or some damn thing. Then the 2 sons got married, and each have 2 kids. So, from 6 people, you have 12 people, inhabit, living in the same situation. It was in other discussions, and people were asking me, the interview with the young kid toward the end. A whole generation was telling you, we don't expect to have children. We don't expect to have saving. That's how the economic reality for them. It's not that they don't want it, they could not afford to have them. And I think it's very serious. You have a whole generation of young people feeling that way. So I do feel that, and then of course the political evolution of Hong Kong, the basic law and all that, did promise universal suffrage. You're also reaching that point. They feel that now is an opening for them to retake our lives, retake control of our lives back. And that's basically my observation, because I'm not of race generation. I'm basically I'm an observer of what's happening. And so I also want to present one piece of information, is that, I did request Carrie Lam for interview, and which she declined and did not direct me to anybody else. So I'm basically using official material that's put on the government website to present the point of view. Yeah. So I did my best to follow journalistic practice to present either side, but on the other hand, it's about the movement. And I found the people, you can't expect me to have the film to be about what government was saying. So basically that's the background.
Thank you. Ray, do you want to speak about the the identity of the movement in terms of generation and gender and place.
Yeah, I would like to add a few sentences on the differences of the identity between Hong Konger and Chinese. Actually, the gap between these two identity wasn't that significant before, I would say before 2012. But since 2003, the Chinese government allowed Chinese people to come to Hong Kong for travel, and they also relaxed the policies for Chinese tourists to Hong Kong. So from 2003 to 2010, there was a significant increase of amount of Chinese tourists in Hong Kong. I would say before this period, Hong Kong people didn't really think who we are, what identity we are. We just simply believe that, okay, our ancestors, my parents are from China, so probably we are all Chinese. But after a huge amount of Chinese tourists traveling to Hong Kong, we have seen so many differences between these two groups of people. For example, as Hong Kong is such a small city, orders in public space is very important to maintain the society. So everyone would at least respect the private space of other people and the order. But Chinese tourists, when they come to Hong Kong, they not only don't respect our rules, our culture, our social conventions, but they even degrade our rules. Say that their culture and their mindset after 2008, as China has become one of the world big power, they would say that the system in Hong Kong is already outdated. They are the future. So Hong Kong people should learn from China. And when some journalists ask about their bad behavior in Hong Kong, they would say, without Chinese tourists, Hong Kong is nothing. So after all these incidents, Hong Kong people started to rethink, oh, are they really the same kind as us? Do we really want to be the same group as them? That is the starting point of the, I would say, the creation of our own identity. And since then, getting more scholars and also students to discuss about our own identity. So I would say the anti-extradition law movements last year, it's not only about the extradition law, but also about the conflict between these two identities.
Thank you so much. Michael, would you like to comment?
My microphone's on. I would just add, I mean, I started teaching in Hong Kong in 1985. So I've spent most of my life in Hong Kong, more than 30 years. And one of the things I know, among the many things that I think Ray and Ivan have already mentioned is the political culture has changed as well. Political awareness has dramatically increased in those years. I remember when I first taught in 1985, I asked my class right after the Sino-British Treaty was signed, I says, what would you prefer if you were allowed to decide, whether Hong Kong was returned to China or not? And first the class rejected my question. They says, well, no one asked us whether it's to be returned or not. So, you know, we haven't thought about it. I said, well, humor me, you know, I've just arrived here and I'm curious what you would think. And it was interesting that the conclusion they reached, to show sort of a lack of political culture, is the class almost unanimously voted that they would have Hong Kong returned to China and then hire the British to run it. And so this struck me as a really interesting choice. And this would be the parents' generation of Ray, basically, that were in my university classes. I was then at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. But it's quite, I mean, it's an interesting concept because it reflects a kind of, yeah, we're Chinese, loyalty to China, but we don't trust the Chinese system. And so over the years, and I've watched this evolve, I think Ray put his finger on it. He says, with the protest against patriotic education, actually a little bit before that, there were protests over a high-speed rail and intrusion into some local villages and stuff. And at that time, there was very little political content. The protest was more about the livelihood of the villagers and everything that would be threatened. And I was thinking at the time, because I had gone through the Article 23 protest in 1989, I'd been in many protests. And I was thinking at the time, I hope these youngsters understand that the decision itself is what matters. It's the political process that decides whether these livelihood issues will be addressed or not. And it didn't take long. And by the time they're protesting against patriotic education, it was clear the central theme was how you run Hong Kong and not just whether the policy has an economic impact. So along with Evans, I agree that economics is there, but for the protesters, very often they don't want to be dismissed as just being arguing over money. They want to make a clear message that we're Hong Kongers. And I think that's very much a part of the protest. And in the context of China, that's important because China always wants to dismiss people's protest against their political system by saying, oh, we just throw money at them. The Tibetans get this, the Uyghurs get, everyone gets, oh, we invest money. Why are they so unhappy? But money is not the only solution to the problem. There's this political dimension. And so this political awareness, I think, is also very much a part of the current Hong Kong identity.
Thank you. Oh, go. I'm sorry. Thank you so much, everyone. I just got a message from our organizer, Michelle, that we need to wrap up, so we have time to upload this onto YouTube for the audience to watch. I mean, today, right there. I mean, as we've all seen in the news, there's been a new British National Overseas BNO, right? A million Hong Kong citizens can, over the next 3 years, potentially resettle in the UK. And so, you know, what does that mean for the future of Hong Kong and the future of Hong Kong identity? It's very, Agnes, right? In order to run for office, actually had to give up her British citizenship in order to run for office. So, we're kind of, exiting the age of, being able to hold multiple or dual citizenships or to be citizens of the world and to have to choose particular nationalities. But anyway, I think we need to wrap up now. If we if you want to kind of say a final word and a farewell to the audience, I think now is the time to do it. Yeah.
I want to respond. No, I mean, definitely, I won't say that it's the economy is the main reason, but I think economy is very much in the background. And at times I feel the students are talking about democracy is upfront and easy. At the very beginning, Benny Tai acknowledged that when he presented the Occupy movement, there have been a lot of things on the platform, including economic justice. But they feel that at the end that they have to discard all that, and democracy is the simplest. And in a way, it is true that the economy, the political culture and democracy is the way to achieve that, to bring about the economic justice. So but it was a bit indirect. The Occupy, the umbrella movement did not, even some of them reflect, they feel that they could not convince enough people to come around to, because they feel it's a formal demand. It's only the young people who care about things like that. But no, anyway, I mean, that was I just said it's in the background. Of course, I mean, the identity and the struggle for democracy is ongoing. I mean, the whole film is about that. And that's why, you know, the whole theme running through the film is about, you know, these American civil rights movement and how it interacts with Hong Kong. Yeah, so that's my statement. And thank you, you know, all for putting this together. And it's my honor to have my film to open the festival. And thank you, you know, I'm not, you know, closing it. I do feel that that's my final statement. I do appreciate Ray, you know, in Germany, and Michael in maybe New York, participating and, you know, enlightening us. Yeah. Yeah,
Thank
do you have any final statement? I mean, Ray and Michael.
Yeah.
Ray, please.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's my honor to speak here. Thanks for inviting me. I am often asked by a lot of my German friends and also the friends in Europe whether the movement has died out due to the national security law, and also great amount of Hong Kong people is moving out of Hong Kong, maybe going to the UK, maybe seeking asylum in Germany. Then I asked myself, what is Hong Kong and what does Hong Kong mean to me? Is Hong Kong just merely a place or a group of people or a culture? I think this identity is way more than just people living in that place. It's our spirit, our values, our history, our perspective of the world. I think as long as Hong Kong people exist over the world, still ties with each other, this fight will still carry on. So yeah, maybe all the audience might wonder why after the national security law, after the implementations of the national security law, there is no protest. Yeah, because our fight is not only in Hong Kong now, it's all over the world. And we believe the fight between Hong Kong people and the Chinese Communist Party is not only a fight between us, but a fight between the free world, freedom-loving people, and the authoritarian regime. Thank you very much.
Well,